Count-controlled loops in IGCSE Computer Science. It's a loop that repeats a block of code a fixed and predetermined number of times, with an emphasis on the words fixed and predetermined. This type of loop uses an identifier, which is a variable or a counter that gets incremented on each loop. In terms of the syntax for the for loop, it's the following. For identifier, which is the name of the variable that we're going to use as a counter. Then we have an arrow pointing to the identifier, followed by the first value to the second value, which means we're going to start from value 1 and keep incrementing until we reach value 2. For example, if value 1 was 7 and value 2 was 10, we're going to start at 7 and keep incrementing with each loop until we reach 10. So we're going to loop 3 times. And then inside of the for loop, whatever is indented and before the keyword next is our statements or blocks of code. And this is code that's going to repeat with each and every loop. After we're done from the for loop, we're going to exit it using this next statement. Next, followed by the identifier that we're going to use. Just plot the name. And make sure you use the arrow which represents assignment. And make sure to use the arrow which represents assignment instead of using the equal signs, which is a common exam mistake. The equal sign represents equals instead of assignment. We use the for loop when we know the number of iterations before we enter the loop. For example, I have a class of 30 students and I want to loop through each student in this class. Therefore, I'm going to use a for loop and loop 30 times on this class. So for example, this is how we use the for loop in normal syntax, in pseudocode. The I here is our identifier, and it is the variable that holds the current amount of loops that we went through in this loop. Then we have our two values, which are 1 to 10. So we're starting at I equals 1 and incrementing with each loop until we reach I equals 10. Therefore, we're going to loop 10 times. On each loop, we're going to output our text. And when we're done with the 10 loops, we're going to the next statement, which is this next I, which is the name of our identifier. You could name your identifier whatever you want using the same rules we use for naming variables. While loops in IGCSE Computer Science. They are preconditional loops, meaning that they check for the condition before entering the loop. So the syntax for the while loop is while, and then we check for the condition. If the condition is true, we go to the do, and the compiler runs the statements. If the condition is false, the compiler ignores the entire block of code. And as always, we end the statement with an end while to show the compiler that this would be the end of the loop. And make sure you do not forget the do. If you forget it, you're going to lose marks. For example, when we talked about the for loops, using the for loops, you know how many times we're going to iterate through the loop. However, in while loops, we have no idea how many times we're going to repeat the statement. We're going to repeat it until the condition is not true. However, if the condition was false to begin with, we're going to ignore the statement entirely. The compiler would just skip this part and move on with the rest of the program. The following is an example of how we can use while loops. Right here in this program, we're going to input a variable named score. If this score variable, whatever the user inputs here, is less than 0, or if it's greater than 100, that means that the data is invalid. It's correct, it's going to be stored in the variable, but the data must be between 0 and 100. So it's true, but invalid. That's why one of the most popular uses of the while loop is validation, to check that the data is valid. So if the score is less than 0 or greater than 100, we're going to output a prompt to the user to input again. And then we're going to input the same variable again. We're going to repeat this entire statement or block of code until the user inputs a value of score which is between 0 and 100. If they do, we're going to end while and move on with our program. Therefore, the number of loops is still not decided. The user could enter a correct number from the beginning, or they could never enter a correct number. In this example, we're going to create a new variable named num, and we're going to set the value of num to 1. And then we're going to enter a while loop. This while loop would stay active as long as this num variable equals 1. And there's nothing that changes the value of this variable inside our program. Therefore, num will always stay 1, and this loop would always stay active. And this is called an infinite loop. An infinite while loop is where the condition would always be true. And no matter how many times we're going through this statement, the condition would stay true forever. And eventually the compiler would crash out. Repeat until loops in IGCSE computer science. They are post-condition loops, which means that the condition is checked for at the end of the loop. Therefore, we're going to execute the code anyways, and after that we're going to check for the code. The syntax is repeat, and then we're going to have our statements that we're going to loop through. These statements are going to get executed the first time no matter what. And then we're going to enter this until statement. As long as the condition is true, we're going to keep going back to the repeat function and going through our statements again and again. Keep in mind that if the condition is false before we enter the repeat, we're going to execute this statement and then we're going to check for the condition. If the condition is true, we're going to continue with our program. If the condition here is false, we're going to repeat our loop. Keep in mind that if the condition is true before we enter the repeat loop, we're going to execute this statement no matter what, and then we're going to check for the condition. So one of the biggest differences between while loops and repeat until loops is that if the condition in while loops is true, we're going to keep on looping. However, in repeat until, if the condition is false, we're going to repeat the loop and stay inside of it. Another big difference to point out between these two types of loops is that in while loops, the minimum number of iterations is 0. We could not compile any of the statements inside, and we could compile it infinite times or 100 times. It does not matter. However, in repeat until loops, the minimum number of iterations is always 1. We're always going to go through the code and then check for the statement. Based on that, we're either going to go back or continue the program. And a very practical use for the repeat until loop is validation, for example. As firstly, we're going to ask the user to input the data once. If the data is true, we're going to continue. However, if it's false, we're going to go back to the start of the loop and ask them to enter the data again. And we're going to keep repeating all of this until the data they enter is true. And this is an example of the repeat until loop. Firstly, we're going to ask the user to input the data. If it's true, we're going to exit the loop. However, if the data they enter is not valid, based on whatever validation technique we're going to use right here, we're going to repeat and go back to our repeat command right here. And we're going to keep on executing this input right here until the data they enter is true or valid based on our validation technique that we're using. And this was everything about repeat until loops. If you need any help, be sure to contact me. My contact info is in the description below. And thank you for watching.